This podcast is a presentation of EMG, a leading communications agency specializing in developing results-driven content marketing for industrial technology companies. Want to learn more? Drop us a message on Twitter at EMG Marcom. Hello and welcome to this EMG Podcast series on communications in a crisis. I am broadcast journalist and host Chris Merrill. In this series, we're going to look at how industrial players are working their way through today's turbulent environment and what they ought to be doing in the aftermath of this coronavirus crisis, and then how they should prepare for what is an inevitable black swan event the next time it comes up. And I'm delighted today. I'm going to be joined by crisis communications expert Gerard van der Zanden and a TV radio broadcaster turned public relations pro Holly Bentley. Brief introduction here on Gerard. He's got over 30 years of communications and training experience, and he's got a strong background in both government and in industry. In fact, his most recent corporate calling was with LyondellBasell. And when he was with LyondellBasell, he took care of their international communications as a communications manager responsible for all the communications throughout Europe and Asia, and again, internationally. Gerard, welcome to the program. Let me just jump in and ask, how do you think the industry is doing so far when it comes to the communications through this global pandemic crisis?
Well, as a whole, I think it's doing quite well. You can see differences in industries which are prepared and which are not prepared. It depends highly in which segment of industry you're looking. If you look, for instance, at chemical industry, most of the time they have well-prepared plans, and you can tell by the speed and the accuracy of what they are telling to their own people and to the public, because that's the two-way street, which is hugely different from let's say, a normal crisis where a fire or an explosion is involved. That's most of the time, of course, something you communicate internally, but most of the time externally. And now the focus is even 60-40. That means 60% to their own team and about 40% to the outside world. But as a whole, I think the industry is reacting quite good. The most nice thing to see is that the collaboration between industries is really huge, and they are prepared to don't be competitors to one another, but work together and make sure that the stuff which people are looking for at this point of the pandemic is made, is delivered, or is in place.
You hit on a number of different topics here, and I wanted to kind of pick those apart, if I may. You mentioned normal versus what we're seeing as this global pandemic, which I'm assuming is sort of an abnormal crisis. I don't think we've seen anything like this, not in 100 years anyway. So are there different plans in place for some of the well-prepared agencies to have a normal plan of attack for something like a fire or any other supply disruption, for instance, and what we might be seeing with this global pandemic?
Well, yeah, normally you have prepared all possible situations, and the most obvious ones are when something is happening at the industry plant itself, but of a scale as we experience it right now is over an age ago. I think it was in the early 1900s that we had such a pandemic, and that was the last time we encountered it. I can't remember it because I wasn't born then, but I can tell you that this experience is totally different, and also from the phases you're going through, it's quite different from it sounds strange a little bit, but if you talk about a normal crisis, let's say a crisis in general.
I suppose there are different types of crises, right? We've got the external events, fire, pandemic, and then also there are other crises such as internal. Is that fair to say? Where in the United States, I think of Enron 20, 25 years ago, whatever it was, when they had a massive crisis and the whole thing melted down. Are these all the sorts of things that as a communications manager you should be preparing? Internal, external, normal, abnormal, international, localized? Is there a separate plan for all of these different crises?
In most industries prepare in this way, and they are really prepared in all crises you can come up with. So yes, they are prepared, and yes, you are constantly working on new possibilities, new issues you can encounter in doing your business. Give you a little example over the last few years. When you have an IT breach, computer breach, that's quite new for some companies, but that's something that companies, especially in the larger industries, are preparing for and making sure that they have a plan in place and that they can react to it.
Gerard, you've worked not only with the chemical companies, but also with Royal DSM, Office Depot, Rockwool. You've seen a number of different, I guess, perspectives from a number of different industries. Is there a different way, to go back to what you mentioned before in dealing with this crisis, about 60% internally, 40% externally? Is there a different way that some of these companies may approach a crisis? And who do they prioritize? Employees? Is it vendors? Is it other partners? Is it the investors? How does somebody begin coming up with that plan of attack?
In fact, you get the question by itself, and in normal life, you have the event and you get the response to it, and that will go to the outside world in quite a fast way. Now you can see that you have an outside event which is affecting the company. So where a normal crisis is from going from the inside out, now it's coming from the outside in. And people are worried about their own health, obviously, but also taking in account, next step, if it's clear what I have to do and how we arrange our business, how we organize our business, what can we do to help society, to help the neighbors, because that's mostly what happens, to survive this pandemic.
That point in itself, I think, is interesting, because it would seem that putting the neighborhood, let me use the neighborhood in a broad term, putting the neighborhood first seems to be a good PR move as well. I mean, not only morally does it seem like a sound advice, but from a public relations standpoint, crisis management, and we've seen this with companies that are producing ventilators, auto manufacturers producing ventilators now, and some of the other industrial companies, as we've talked about, who are putting out masks. That seems to be, from a crisis management standpoint, the morally upstanding thing to do is the right thing to do from a crisis perspective.
I think there's a need, and I think there is a need from society, and it's not PRing or making a good show out of it. It's a necessity to shift your business. And I give you a little example of a big brewery in the Netherlands who stopped beer production and started to make disinfectants for your hands and for nurses and doctors. So here you see that it is a genuine reaction to some needs which are really there. And since we stopped flying, we need to do it locally. So what you see is that the dependency on what happens in a region is more important than it was ever before, because some systems in our supply chain are down. It's as simple as that.
So I think communication obviously is huge too, and that's something else we're seeing here in the United States when companies are shifting and making hand sanitizers, but also, putting your name out there to show that you can step up as a company and help and provide the resources that you actually have. I'm wondering how fascinated you have been with the empathy factor as well, from what we've seen with companies and big box stores and things, that they've been shifting their message to show that they're empathetic. So communication's big, but how big of a part does empathy play in a pandemic as well?
Well, empathy is quite important, but as I said, it's a necessity as well, because the shortage through the supply chains is there. The limitations of production is there. So look, in the US, we have a Dutch company called Philips, and they were producing fans, very sophisticated fans for intensive care. But they now decided also to have a second production line in which they have a simpler version so they can operate in the hospital, deliver to the hospital in a faster way. So there you see that business systems stay in place, but they want to take responsibility and they want to deliver, let's say, in the country, in the region, because a lot of the supply is not present anymore.
Gerard, I'd like to ask sort of a delicate question here, and I hope that I don't sound like a buffoon as I ask this, but how does somebody determine the right amount of braggadociousness they should attach to their efforts? For instance, you mentioned Phillips, or we mentioned the local brewery making the hand sanitizers. It is in their best interest to get their brand out there and let people know that they've done that. At the same time, they don't want to come across as trying to capitalize on a tragedy. Is there a way to determine what the right level of branding is around these efforts?
If you don't poster it yourself, if you don't use it in a commercial way, I think it's genuine, and most industries are reacting in this way. It's the way to go, I would say. Until now, I didn't see many companies using their special things they are doing in these difficult times. No, they just do it. They get the question, they try to deliver, and most of the time they have very smart business systems that they can, business or production systems that they can deliver. So it's genuine. They don't brag about it. They don't make a big PR stunt out of it. They just do it. And I think that's the way to go. And that's what most companies do. And there is no difference in the US or China or Europe. They are all delivering in the same way and trying to make their contribution. And I think that's the magic word. They try to contribute to a situation which we never encountered. And that's the magic word, just contribute.
If I'm running a company, and Holly is my customer, so to speak, or one of my vendors, does Holly pay attention to whether or not my company responded when she's getting ready to make her next purchasing decision? Does she pay attention to if I'm the brewery that flipped my machining over to be able to make hand sanitizer versus the brewery that just closed up shop and sent everybody home? Does she pay attention to that community involvement that my company had in a time of crisis?
It's not a matter of just being the brewer or being the medical producer who wants to shift to deliver something to the market. It's a joint effort, and they need their partners. That's clear, and they also need a third party. So no, I don't think that's an issue. It's more or less a natural thing to do at this moment.
Chris, I think some of the companies that I've been seeing here in the U.S. and that have been doing that's been a really big discussion about, the companies that are stepping up, the ones that are donating mattresses, making hand sanitizers, delivering food, or helping out with underprivileged. And I really do think that even though they are stepping up and doing the right thing, that will resonate with people in this community and any community across the world once, this all plays out. I definitely think next time I'm probably going to go to the brewery that stepped up.
Yeah, that was sort of my question is are you almost, and I don't mean to sound callous about this, but are you almost buying goodwill with the community, with your vendors, with your customers, simply by, again, doing the right thing that we've been discussing along the way here?
Yeah, and I think it's the way to go. And it's as I said, as long as you don't PR it, as long as you don't use it for commercial use.
Gerard, fascinating conversation. I want to continue with you here in our next episode when we'll talk about the aftermath, coming out of a crisis such as the coronavirus or others, as we've discussed, maybe some of the localized crises and some of those things that, and again, we've seen it in business around the world, that can be self-inflicted as well. So I'm really looking forward to hearing a little bit of your take on what do we do now? So that'll be in our next episode. It's been a pleasure talking with you thus far. Holly Bentley is a television radio broadcaster who went to the professional side of public relations. She got an honest job is what happened. I'm broadcast journalist Chris Merrill, and of course, our very special guest with over 30 years of communications and training experience is Gerard van der Zanden, and it has been a pleasure speaking with you here this afternoon. Thank you so much for your time. This podcast has been presented by EMG, a leading communications agency specializing in developing results-driven content marketing for industrial technology companies. You want to learn more? Drop us a message on Twitter at EMG Marcom. This podcast is a presentation of EMG, a leading communications agency specializing in developing results-driven content marketing for industrial technology companies. Want to learn more? Drop us a message on Twitter at EMG Marcom. Hello and welcome to the EMG Podcast series on communications in a crisis. I'm broadcast journalist and host Chris Merrill. Delighted to welcome back crisis communications expert Gerard van der Zanden and TV, radio broadcast professional turned public relations expert Holly Bentley. And Gerard and Holly, we were talking in our first episode about crisis communications during the coronavirus situation and, of course, other crises as well. But we start to see some glimmers of hope. We start to see some light at the end of the tunnel, and maybe it's time to start talking about the aftermath in a crisis. And I guess the most glaring question I have when it comes to the aftermath is, how do we know when the crisis is over? It seems that, especially in the case of the coronavirus, we're getting mixed messages. Could be from the government, could be from NGOs, could be from our employers. How do we even know it's time to start looking forward?
That's a really interesting question. In fact, I think first thing we need to do is, hey, what happened and what did we learn from it? Next thing to do is, okay, and how are we able to fix this problem? We did a lot, that's as we heard in our earlier podcast, but what's the next stage we will go into? And then you can look at other regions, what's happening down there. If you look at China, where it's all started, you now see a second wave of possible containment. Is this going through? Is it for a certain part of the country? We don't know exactly yet, but that is interesting to see, because our policies could be different then from what we need to do down here. And then in the meantime, we need to make sure that our executive teams stay in their role, because it's something that will go on. And okay, we are entering a new stage, and perhaps we can see a little light at the end of the tunnel. But at this stage over here in Europe, we're talking about economy in which people need to keep distance from one another and socialize in a distant way with another. There you will have a next step which we never did before, and which will be completely in line with the smart thing to do because of COVID-19.
So really taking precaution and listening. I think, something Chris and I had been talking about, and really another question that we don't even know if there's an answer to, but okay, you're a company and you are following guidelines. Your government officials or the powers that be are telling you that it is safe to go back to work. But then you have a bunch of employees as well who are saying, we don't necessarily feel comfortable just yet. We work in an area where we are very close in proximity to one another. So we're wondering, do you follow what is recommended, or as a company, do you kind of regroup and say, this is what's going to work for us?
Well, most of the time, I think in the US, it's the state government. Down here, it's national government who will give you directions in how to operate and how to keep it safe. And it's clear that companies will align with what they are doing down there. And the next set of plans will be in line, of course, with government policy. But then they will start to reopen shops. They will start to have national supply chains to those shops or to industries. So all in all, it will start. And let's be clear on this one. And this is more of a personal note. If our nurses and doctors were so brave to go on, we need to be brave as well. And perhaps that's something in the next stage which industries will call upon as well.
How much of the messaging for the aftermath of a crisis is set early on, and how much of that messaging has to be developed as the crisis is proceeding? And in my example, of course, with the coronavirus, we talked about strategic planning for a crisis coming up. And of course, there are different stages through a crisis, the beginning, the kind of the body of the crisis, and then the aftermath. How much of that aftermath or that summary of what's happening is determined beforehand, and how much of it do we have to kind of be real flexible with? How much of that do we fly by the seat of our pants, so to speak?
Well, I'm not sure here. I think the situation is so unique that we never encountered a situation which went on over such a long period of time. So that's for starters. Then there is a second party, as I mentioned already, governmental institutions and also doctors giving us some sound advice, which companies need to take into account. So their plans can be their plans from a strategic point of view, but then they still need to be tactical and make sure that they connect with what a government or the officials demand from that on that point of time for the safety of their people. And of course, a company will go in line with that.
We don't know exactly at this point of when we're recording this podcast, we don't know exactly how sort of returning to normal life is going to look. Are some essential businesses going to slowly expand and broaden their offerings, whereas others may remain shuttered for a little bit longer? Will everything reopen at once? We don't know exactly what it's going to be, but if we've got sort of a stair-step approach, incremental approach, you may have instances where one business is open, but their supplier is still shuttered. Or you may have an instance where you've got one business that's open, but their supplier is not manufacturing the parts that they might need. That supplier may still be manufacturing masks and ventilators for people who are still ill. So how does somebody effectively communicate to all parties involved, whether it's the customers or the vendors or the investors, that this is part of the process that we're going through right now? Be patient without really scaring people off or without creating any more unnecessary concern on the parts of those people who are involved.
Well, in fact, the problem already is there because most countries close their borders. So supply chains are cut through and a lot of needed basic materials or other stuff can't come into the countries where the plants are. So the situation is already there, meaning that you can look at alternatives. You can work together. Well, at the start of this crisis, we saw some great examples of industries working together to deliver to society the first needs. Now they can look at one's supply chains and see whether they can help one another. But it will be on a local level, and I think internationally, for the next few months, there will be a problem because supply chains will run into shortages and some industries will need supply from outside country borders.
How do we effectively communicate that concern that we might have? You know, if somebody comes to me and says, I need 10,000 widgets by Friday, but my company can't produce 10,000 widgets by Friday because we're still waiting on frillies. I don't know. I'm making this up as I go. And that can't be happening. Obviously, I'm going to have to communicate to this company, I can't get you your 10,000 widgets by Friday. How much understanding should there be and how much push should there be from the different vendors? It seems like working together sounds like a really great plan, but we also know that in the business world, not everybody works together. Sometimes you've got somebody who's pushing a little harder than someone else. How do we effectively communicate, stay honest, stay transparent, but also maintain that positive relationship in the face of somebody who's more demanding?
That's a difficult question. That's something we need to look into, and industries are looking into this. But that will be determined by the executive team at that point of time, and you will get there some difficult situations in which it's hard to go in the old-fashioned way of supply chain, and you really need to go to alternatives, and it will be business as usual because you want to make sure that you can produce whatever you're making as an industry. So if he can deliver it, he can think with you. And the third party can think with you and offer an opportunity to solve the problem, or in a later stage lose as a third party that big company and they move on as well. So all in all, I think chances are that working together still will be in place for a long period of time.
Is there a particular message that you as a communications expert would work with the executive or the C-suite to craft that? And I'm assuming honesty, transparency, but also you can't be I mean, you have to maintain hope throughout your messaging, right? You can't come out and say, we're not going to be able to produce anything, right? I mean, you have to say, we're really looking forward to producing your widgets. We just won't be able to do it by Friday, but here's our projections. I mean, is this the message that you craft?
Could be. If that's the tactical choice a company is going for, that's throughout possible. But you could think of alternatives, and that's really up to the decision of the industry as such. So I think that will differ by the different businesses you will look at.
Yeah, I hope there's a level of understanding between all companies as far as, where they are in the aftermath and what position they're holding, and just to not lose business partners or to not lose business, but maybe to have just a mutual understanding of, even though this is over, so to speak, that they're going to move forward together and complement their efforts.
And again, as a communications expert, you've seen some people are going to work with exactly what Holly just laid out. They're going to say, yeah, listen, we're all in this together. We all understand. But we also know that there are some very, what we would call type A individuals who don't really care that you're having supply chain issues. They're only worried about their own supply chain issues. And I suppose the messaging becomes critical at that point. Is this maybe the most stressful time for anybody in the communications and marketing field, is that they have to work through a crisis, whether it's an international crisis or a pandemic, or whether it's a localized crisis? Is this the most trying time for that group?
Well, it's not only for the communications guy, of course. It's the marketing guy, the sales guy, the guy in supply chain who has the same worry and will work on it. So all in all, yes, I will try and help them crafting the right message, but the real choice is not made by me. It's not made by the executive team as such, but if they are smart, they have a specialized team in place, and they are looking into this kind of matters. And I know there are companies already looking in this kind of direction. Okay, how can we change to source certain materials from a different place, which is logical, and they will work on it. And at a later stage, if they have a very, very smart solution to solving their problem, they probably will come to us as a communications agency and ask, okay, let's craft this into a message, and let's see the world that we do it differently now.
You said something there that I think is a great segue, and we want to invite people to stay here for our third episode when we talk about preparing for the next crisis. And you made mention of having that strategic plan in place, and that's really what we want to be able to really tackle here in our third episode as we continue with our EMG podcast series on communications in a crisis. And Gerard van der Zanden is our expert. The man knows more than so many of us combined. He's an absolute genius, 30 years of experience and working with some of the largest companies in the world. And it is great to have Gerard as our guest here. Holly Bentley is a television and radio broadcast alum. Let me say that. She's gotten out of the trenches, and she has made her way to the C-suite as well as the public relations pro. So she's adding as well, and of course giving us that insight that is necessary. I'm Chris Merrill. I am a broadcast journalist. I am still one of the slugs in the trenches, and it has been it's been a pleasure being with you. Please join us for our next episode, Preparing for the Next Crisis, as we continue on with our EMG podcast series. EMG is a leading communications agency specializing in developing results-driven content marketing for industrial technology companies. And you want to learn more? Drop us a message on Twitter at EMG Marcom. This podcast is a presentation of EMG, a leading communications agency specializing in developing results-driven content marketing for industrial technology companies. Want to learn more? Drop us a message on Twitter at EMG Marcom. Hi, and welcome to the third episode of this EMG podcast series about communications in a crisis. I'm broadcast journalist and host Chris Merrill. Joining me is our communications expert, Gerard van der Zanden, and we, of course, also have our incredible television and radio veteran and PR pro, Holly Bentley, with us as well on the podcast. And Gerard, we have talked about how to deal with a crisis during the crisis. We've talked about the aftermath. But one of the things that I want to make sure we discuss is how do we get ready for a crisis? There's no doubt that every company, every industry will face another crisis in the future. Hopefully it's the distant future, but everyone will have to deal with some of these times. How do we prepare for that crisis, especially after what we just went through globally with the coronavirus? Is there a checklist that we should go down, and has that checklist changed?
I think the checklist changed in a huge way, especially if you look at the digital means we have of communicating with one another. I think the online business as a whole, online tools, grew to a mature level, and we are now able to communicate in a way with one another faster, more complete, and in a very professional way. So I think that will be one, not only a takeaway, but a real big game changer in the world of communications. Look at all the video meetings going on. If you look, and I'm living in the Netherlands, as I told earlier on, look at the moment, if you look at traffic, it's 1/3 less of what it's normally, and still business is going on, and still we are communicating with one another. In a way, we are learning, and in a way, I think we will get a different world in which online business will be one of the biggest tools we need to overcome it.
Does that affect communication with your different customers or your vendors? In the past, maybe you put out a press release. Now, maybe you just pull up a video chat. You Zoom with them. Or I should also mention that in our exercising of social distancing, we've put a hemisphere between us, and we're using Microsoft Teams for our podcast here. It doesn't get much more socially distant than that. But is this part of the new communications almost instantaneous? Instead of a press release, now it's a video chat.
It's a video chat, or I even saw CEOs coming online telling their part of the story, and not only for customers, but also for their own teams, reassuring that they were taking care of business, making sure that they understand what's going on, and going into things which you normally in a message or a press release or a statement couldn't tell, and are able to tell even with an emotion on your face, which is great, which is good, and which is something new, I think, to us. And that's what I meant by the game changer, by using this type of tools. That will be a big change.
This is a great point that you just made, and that has to do with the emotion on somebody's face, and touching on that. In this new way of communicating, especially during a crisis, that emotion, that sincerity seems to be of the utmost importance. So what if your CEO is Fatty McMoneybags and he doesn't really come across with a sympathetic face? Does it need to be the CEO, or can you come up with a spokesperson, a sympathetic spokesperson, somebody from the PR crowd, somebody like yourself, somebody like Holly, who can come out, effectively communicate, and let people know that, we do care about you, we are with you? How important is the face of the company in situations like this moving forward?
It's really important, and if people don't come across, most of the time they hate being on video or even on a mic. Most of the time that goes hand in hand. So if a CEO is not the guy to have in front of your camera or have in front of your mic for the podcast or for the video chat, don't do it, and don't stress him, because he's got other business to take care of. And probably his CFO or CIO or whoever in his executive team is able and is willing and has that nice face to put the story in the right perspective.
Now that we've determined, okay, guys, we're getting ready for the next potential crisis, we want to make sure that we pick the right person who's got the right face. Here are our communication outlets, our modes of communication, whether it's social media, whether it's video chat, whether it's a YouTube, podcast, whatever it might be. We go through that. How much of a message for a crisis can be crafted ahead of time, or does it need to be crafted on the spot using similar principles based on whatever that crisis might be, localized, regionalized, or a pandemic like this?
Most companies like to have a crisis communication plan in place. And most of the time we write scenarios behind it and make sure that we have, let's say, the outlines of statements, the outline of storylines, and the possibility to deliver in a very short time the right story to whoever is going on camera. If not, within our company we have great writers like Robin, like other guys, who can take care of the text and craft it in, let's say, half an hour to a text which will come across and which will deliver the message which needs to be delivered, whatever it is.
You see a lot of companies kind of regrouping and figuring out, hopefully as far as preparing for the next crisis, do you see them regrouping, figuring out a different plan, talking amongst themselves to figure out what worked during this pandemic, what didn't work, and maybe putting a new plan in place? Or would you recommend that companies do that first and foremost?
Oh, no. We already have the questions from companies, from bigger corporate companies who ask for assistance, who want another outline or a more specific written tools ready in place in their crisis communication plan. So that happens already. And even during the very early start of the corona pandemic, companies already asked us to prepare messages for their own people, for the neighbors, for society, to deliver whatever needed to be told about the situation at their plant or at their site.
Gerard, this is going to seem like a very simple question, but forgive me, I haven't been in this situation before. How do I know if I'm in the midst of a crisis? I mean, doesn't that sound silly? But if my CEO dies, I know I've got some sort of a PR crisis, but if I had a plan in place, it's not a huge crisis. However, if my entire organization shuts down because of a global pandemic, we're in a major crisis all of a sudden. How do I know what script or what narrative, what storyline to go to? Is this intuitive? Is this why there are experts in the field, or is there sort of a textbook I can follow?
Well, a textbook is not in place. That's for sure. As I said, you have a global outline. There are examples worldwide where you can learn from, and most companies do. And there we can help in putting together best practices from other regions of this world, which we use to write the stuff together and make sure that there is a proper crisis communications plan in place. Covering all situations, Chris, impossible, not doable. Covering, let's say, 70 to 80% of it, doable. Sometimes people laugh because when I did a year ago, when I did my trainings and we were talking about a pandemic, people were talking funny about it because that doesn't happen in the rest of the world. That's a strange story. No.
Right.
That's never going to happen. And now it's here, and we have to deliver. So yeah, you learn from it for sure.
Does the communications team in any organization, do they sit down in a strange exercise and start brainstorming disasters? Do they start thinking what's the worst possible scenario?
Oh, no. We are writing them together with a colleague of mine. We are writing scenarios, and that we train people on those scenarios. So we give an outline of what's happening. And for instance, the IT scenario is one of my training programs, which I exercise with an executive team, with the guys in the crisis communications team, making sure that they understand, okay, what are the next steps? What are we encountering? And am I organized in the way that I think I'm organized? Because that's also a big issue. If you go into a crisis, you can hit upon situations where it seems that your organization can't respond in the way you would like to respond them. So that's also where training is very, very useful, to do that beforehand, before any crisis arrives at your place.
As things are changing here, of course, we've seen these changes recently, and you touched upon it with social media, with some of the outreach that we've got now. Does this change the limitations a company might have in responding to crises, either for the better or maybe to their own detriment? Does it change how that company can be flexible in times like this?
It gives them speed. It gives them opportunity. Reacting to social media of a big corporate is not likely, because then you will go into discussions where you don't want to be. So let's say the generic social media stuff, the fun stuff, where people are chatting with one another and making accusations and telling funny stories, that's not something a big corporate will go into. But making sure that they have an own channel and making sure that there is a Facebook or a LinkedIn or whatever page, that's the big companies in place already.
As a company looks at their social media, do they have any control over the storylines or over that narrative on social media? I know you and I have talked about how in social media things can go down the drain very quickly. A friend of mine is a social media manager with a large biotech company, and this crisis has been exacerbated. They really didn't have a plan going into it. The rumors started swirling on social media that the company was withholding testing, that they were intentionally letting people die, and the company really didn't respond to that at all. How does somebody, if they're already dealing with a crisis, and they didn't have a plan in place. Now the crisis is exacerbated. Is there a way to sort of come back from that? And what's the process for sort of returning to a level playing field when it seems that the public is sort of turning on you?
In general, don't go into the discussion with the public, because that's a discussion you never will win. That's not the way to go. But having a social channel available and making sure that there you share the real news, that's important. Talking about a company you mentioned, you can tackle it. Make sure that your you have a presence on your online media. Make sure you share the big message, and people will go there who are looking for the real news.
We're talking about having the plan ready to go, adapting to the new sort of preparation post-corona, that new plan. And so much of this has to do, as you just mentioned, with brainstorming possible scenarios and having your storyline, your narrative ready to go, and then those different distribution channels, choosing the right distribution channels, and then not getting wrapped up in sort of the minutia or the tit for tat that we find on social media, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or some of the other outlets. Am I getting sort of the gist of your messaging here?
Yeah, that's correct. And practice, because the real professional will want to practice. Make sure that you practice the crisis. Make sure that you're familiar with what's going on. Make sure that you feel comfortable as it happens in real life. So that's the reason why we do training programs. That's the reason why we prepare outlines of certain types of stories in certain situations. So there you have the big advantage you can build up as a corporate, making sure that you not only feel comfortable with it, but that you know you are prepared to respond to certain accusations or to certain developments which you don't want to be out on social media.
Gerard has an extensive history dealing with international communications, crisis communications. He's an examiner at Fontys University. He is one of the most well-known and world-renowned communications experts. And I want to sort of get, are you feeling okay there? It seems to be your head is growing as I'm speaking. It's fantastic.
You have
earned it. You've earned all of it. Right. And also with me is Holly Bentley. She's along for the ride. No, she is a PR pro. She is fantastic as well. And when it comes to preparing for that next disaster, she's one of the first people are going to turn to and say, take everything you learned from Gerard, now give us a plan. So I'm just
going to send them to Gerard. I'm not going to help them.
And that's your plan. That's a good plan, too.
That's my plan. That's what I've gotten from this. I'm going to send them your way.
So what I'd like to do, Gerard, is I'd like to sort of put together in our next episode, I'd like to put together that checklist for people like Holly to be able to go through. What are some of the key points? What are we learning throughout this entire ordeal? And then how do we learn from it going forward? Gerard van der Zanden, a pleasure having you here on the podcast, our EMG podcast on communications through a crisis. And EMG is a leading communications agency specializing in developing results-driven content marketing for industrial technology companies. And if you want to learn more, please drop us a message on Twitter at EMG Marcom. This podcast is a presentation of EMG, a leading communications agency specializing in developing results-driven content marketing for industrial technology companies. Want to learn more? Drop us a message on Twitter at EMG Marcom. Welcome to the fourth and final episode of this EMG podcast series on communicating through a crisis. I'm broadcast journalist and host Chris Merrill, and I've been discussing crisis and post-crisis communications with Gerard van der Zanden and TV radio broadcaster turned public relations pro Holly Bentley. Of course, Gerard's been doing this for 30 plus years with some of the largest multinational corporations as well as some NGOs. He is an absolute expert when it comes to communicating not only through a crisis but other communications and communications management. Gerard, here we want to take an opportunity to sort of take all that we learned in the first three episodes of our podcast and put these all together. And I guess the question is, where do we go from here? What did we really learn through the coronavirus crisis, and what can companies have as a takeaway when they put their strategies together moving forward?
Well, one thing is for sure, what we see is that all companies who prepare the crisis plan, a crisis management and crisis communications plan, have a big advantage and are ahead of the lot. It doesn't mean that it covers everything, but at least the start is a clear one. Then for the pandemic we are experiencing right now, the COVID virus, this is a crisis which won't go away very fast. It will stay for weeks, if not for months. So that will mean that what we have prepared will evolve, and we will have to learn from what we see happening in the scene and what we see happening with the business. There it's important to have a team in place which meets when possible every day, give an update, make sure all information is the same, and also make sure start sharing messages to the company, to your colleagues, and to the outside world. And then it's really about evolving the communications through a crisis. That's really important, that people understand, hey, they are working on it. They are thinking for us. They are making sure that our business stays in place, that we keep our job, and that we can go on. Because that's the other part of having a crisis. A crisis could be disruption or even a bankruptcy of a company, and that's something you want to avoid. So making sure that you put out the story both to the inside and the outside world is really, really important. Even if it's not big news, just saying what you're doing to keep in business, that's enough to your team and to the outside world. What will change? What will be the big changes in after this crisis? I think it will be less strategic for the next few years, perhaps even. It will be more based on empathy. We will see that we have to be more flexible, that we have to react and respond perhaps faster and in a different way than we were used to. Not only a press release or not only a press conference, but we need to have online presence. We need to make sure that we have several tools of that online presence, and show as a company that you have a real sound heart for your community, for your teams, for your people, and for society as a whole. So I think as a takeaway over the last podcast we did, that's about it.
If we were to talk about winners and losers, and I want to talk about this from sort of a corporate standpoint, I suppose we could talk about a corporate, NGO, governmental, whatever it might be. But if we talk about winners and losers, it seems like the surefire way to come out of a crisis like this is a winner, especially when we talk about the coronavirus, is what you just touched on, and that is having a heart, being empathetic, remaining hopeful, transparent, honest with your customers, with your, with investors, with your third parties, whatever that might be. These seem to be sort of the formula to win in a crisis like this. And I use the word win, and there really is no winning or losing, I suppose. But how do we come out stronger, let me say that, as an organization? And it seems to be that a message from that pure, hopeful emotion is the right balance.
Yeah, the right balance and a different way of doing competition with one another. Perhaps it's not only of being the cheap party or being the big party or being the one who is having the most commercials. Perhaps in the near future it also has to do, okay, he is really committed. I can understand what they are doing. Their story sticks with me. I think that's really going to be different than it was until now.
It seems as that's sort of our new normal, is finding that narrative or the storyline sort of starts from a different place. It almost starts from not necessarily from the image of the organization, but it almost starts sort of a communal attitude where we consider our message and how that's going to be received, which of course we've always done. But now it's how we connect necessarily with our customers or with our vendors or with our investors or whatever else it is. Rather than trying to promote or protect a brand, it seems to be all about promoting and protecting the community in which we operate. Is that a fair assessment? Am I being clear enough?
Yeah, it's a good assessment, I think, and that's one of the changes which will take place and which will get more prominent on the ladder of things we have to do. But on the other hand, I think that will be the new future for being more outspoken on where business changes are, why they are there, and why we need it. So I think even the storytelling will be more accessible for outside people, will have a need to show what their role in society is.
as we press forward here, somebody comes to you, say it's me and Widget Company, or it's Holly and her supply chain, whatever that might be. If somebody comes to you and says, okay, we don't have anything ready for a crisis management. We have nothing set for communication moving forward. Where do we start? How do you start with a company now post-corona? Because everything has changed, as we know, from communication to reaction to the messaging, the storylines. When you sit down with somebody, where do we start? I
would say call EMG. Make sure you get...
Call EMG.
Yes, we'll take care of you.
That's right. Right.
Yeah, no, get the proper assessment of what is in place, because that's important to know. From there, take the new situation, which for each and every company is different, and start a discussion with the executive team, with the people of the company. Okay, which way do we want to go, and which things are smart to organize in a different way, or in a way you already have organized it, but you can be more open or be more creative, whatever. The fun part is that if you're talking to an engineer, it's the daily normal for them, although they have great stories. And I think that's one of the things which will happen, that companies, businesses will be more open and will be more accessible and prepared to share this type of stories and get people to know them better. Let's put it this way.
How does a company, in the midst of a crisis, and this is what a crisis is, I suppose, is that things get worse before they get better. So how does a company effectively communicate throughout, even if they have to deliver more bad news? Whether it's a company that has to lay off, hundreds of employees and then come out saying, we did it for the betterment of everybody, except it seems for those employees. How do you be honest and transparent and empathetic when you're also giving bad news or making some of those very difficult decisions? And how do you craft that storyline?
Well, that's very simple to answer, because start earlier, start before the crisis, sharing stories. Start building that image of the company, start building the image of the teams working there and the people working there, and that people understand what's going on down there. And from there, pick it up. And if you are in a crisis, you have some reference stories you can ask for, or how should I say, well, you can make up your storyline yourself.
Making up the storyline as we go. If you've got a real pro, it seems like you can do that, especially when you're trying to be fluid, as you mentioned, fluid and flexible while remaining empathetic, or you're remaining true to your themes of empathy and hope and those sorts of things. However, I also wonder about the conversation. Can your messaging be almost a dialogue with your interested parties, whether it's those investors or the vendors or the customers or the employees? Can you have an open dialogue, maintaining that empathy, that honesty, and that hope, and still come out looking better than we would if, for instance, we were worried about brand management at the time?
Well, it's not per se a matter of looking better. It also could be that people understand the background of certain stories, and I think that's really key. And being the good guy is not really the purpose of having stories in advance in society and to the outside world. Having stories in the outside world is that you have some kind of a main line which you can use to connect with the stories you need to share in times of crisis. I think that's the most important. If a company is a black box, you never will be loved. And if you only come out during a crisis, people will not understand, you will not get much of empathy, and they will dislike your story. So that's the reason why you need to come out with all types of stories beforehand. Even telling that you are preparing for crisis and things like what's going on, like a pandemic, making sure that people understand, hey, this company is really taking care and is really making an effort of doing the right things.
I loved your point earlier, too, as far as reaching out to EMG. If you are a company and you are a leader and you see that there could be any sort of, if you don't have a plan in place, or you're not 100% sure about the plan that you have moving forward from what you've learned, I think, from the previous pandemic or the previous crisis, to not be afraid to reach out and get some guidance, because you don't want to fall short the next time. You don't want to have to be spending energy on putting out fires. I think it's more important to make sure that you do reach out for help and that you do have a really solid plan in place, whatever the crisis could be.
Or even now, for instance, is that fair to say, Gerard? Is that even now, if your company is still not, and we've seen this, we've seen a number of companies that still seem to be floundering and almost waiting for the crisis to pass them by so they can resume activities as usual. It seems like even now there's still an opportunity for an organization to sort of step up, I suppose, and get a message out there that is beneficial to everyone, whether it's their organization or their third parties or their communities.
Oh, absolutely. It's wise to do, and never say never again, and it's never too late to start something like this.
Gerard, on that, I think we're gonna let you off the hook, my friend. It's been an absolute pleasure having you for this series, and I look forward to. Well, I'm going to tell you this, Gerard. I do not look forward to the next crisis.
No, I don't think any of us do.
I hope the next time that you and I talk, it's about putting together employee handbooks or something, because I hope we don't have to deal with a pandemic or any sort of a global crisis such as this again. All right.
Or an after lunch stroll or something like that.
That sounds good to me. Sounds good to me. Again, thanks again to EMG, who's put together this podcast series on communication through a crisis. Thanks to Gerard van der Zanden, who is one of the most talented communications experts in the world. He's worked for some of the largest corporations, NGOs, an examiner at Fontys University. The man is a legend in our minds, anyway. So thank you so much for your time. To Holly Bentley, our PR pro, who's able to work with EMG to put things together and pull the trigger and make everything happen. To Robin Wires, to Varsha Lala, Dragana Stankovsky, and everybody that's been behind the scenes. You guys have been absolutely a real treat from the word go. So thank you so much from everybody involved. And we look forward to talking to you again on our next EMG podcast series. EMG is a leading communications agency specializing in developing results-driven content marketing for industrial technology companies. You want to learn more? Drop us a message on Twitter at EMG Marcom.